the nice thing that I discovered is that even if you don't have a smart classroom, right, with a smart board, and you can write straight on it with one of those markers specially made, not the wrong ones because then you're using the smart board, there are actually virtual digital whiteboards online. And so I found one, and here it is. And so there are some things that I want to write on the board and I'll type, so they'll actually be legible, which you might not have been if I used some other sort of board. And there's some things I'm expecting I want to diagram, and so we'll talk about that as well. So today I want us to focus on the passages in the Bible that relate to resurrection, belief in the resurrection, belief that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and talk about the resurrection in general and the relevant passages. And then next time we're actually going to have a second class period dedicated to this topic, and so we can talk more, we can have open questions and make it more discussion oriented. So this time I'm going to try and cover some of the major topics. And one of the first things that has to be said is about resurrection in general. Belief in the resurrection is not the same thing as belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And that's an important point in terms of background to what Christians believe about Jesus and what they came to believe about Jesus. We've already seen this semester that various texts that we've read throughout the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish scriptures don't actually focus on, don't explicitly mention, don't assume that either the author or the readers believe in an afterlife. And so if we ask the question, when does belief in an afterlife first appear, or when does it take root in Judaism? Although it's hard to answer that question with a high degree of certainty. Right? All we have are texts, and those texts are like fossils. They can give us an indication that by this point that belief had arisen, but that's not the same thing as actually knowing all the details that we'd like to know about the process. But one text that seems to be a key moment in the development of this belief is the book of Daniel. And most scholars associate the book of Daniel with an important event in the history of the Jewish people, the Maccabean Revolt, which was an attempt to regain religious freedom in the first instance, and then eventually political freedom, during the time of a Syrian ruler who was ruling over the territory in which the Jewish people, for the most part, found themselves, a ruler named Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. And for reasons that we won't get into today, he outlawed the observance of the Jewish law. And that meant that, whereas in the past people had pondered the problem of evil, why bad things sometimes happen to good people, and the thing that's even more annoying, why good things sometimes happen to bad people, right, which really sometimes gets on our nerves. Here there was a new situation, or a new kind of problem of evil, where those who are most dedicated to being faithful to God's law are being singled out for persecution and sometimes death. How do you make sense of that? How can God allow that? Won't God do something to right the wrong, to address this injustice? And it seems to be against that background that some Jewish thinkers took the step of affirming that even death won't stop God from vindicating the righteous and punishing the wicked. And so it's in this period that we see belief in an afterlife coming to the fore, being more asserted. And towards the end of the book of Daniel, right, we get for the first time reference to resurrection as an expectation regarding the afterlife. It says, Daniel 12, verse 2, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." And so in Judaism, right, human beings are viewed as having been created as what we might call in technical terms a psychosomatic unity. In other words, body, soul, all that stuff. Not thought of as separate components and one separates from the other, but as a unity. Right? The account in Genesis said that God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul or a living being. Not that he was endowed with a soul or something like that, but that he becomes a living being, right, as a of being having a unified existence, which includes life, flesh and blood, mind, all those things. And so, not surprisingly, Jewish belief in the afterlife focused, for the most part, and there was a diversity of views by the time we get to around the time of Jesus. Some believed in things like the immortality of the soul, as others did in Greek culture. But the majority view, for those who accepted some sort of afterlife, was resurrection of the dead. In other words, God will restore the dead to life. And whether it will be an existence rather like current existence, whether it will take a very different form, again, there were different views on that. This is something which, even today, Christians assert and maintain in creedal statements, although it's not that common, or certainly it's not the focus of a lot of Christian thought about the afterlife in our time. On the one hand, most famously in, let's say, the Nicene Creed, right, believe in the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come. That's not a statement about belief in Jesus, that's a statement about Christian belief in an afterlife that involves resurrection. If you ask most Christians today who believe in some sort of afterlife what they're expecting, what do you think they'd say? Go to heaven when they die. Right? And while they might, at least in theory, talk about resurrection, they're not talking about it for the most part. It's not the focus. Right? And if it were taken out of the picture, I think for a lot of people it would be nothing lost. Yet, Christian belief that arises in the New Testament, right? And this is why I'm focusing on this as the context and the background. When Christians said that they believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead, they weren't saying that they believed that he had been what we might call resuscitated, revived, right? Divine defibrillator, right? Kind of does the electrical shock thing, and Jesus comes back to life in the form in which he previously existed. What the early Christians assert is that Jesus has been raised from the dead in the sense of that final resurrection, which was expected to happen to everyone at the end of time. And that's a crucial point to note for a number of reasons. One of which is that it shows that rather than the early Christians simply taking beliefs that they already had and trying to make sense of what had happened to Jesus through the lens of those, clearly something, some experiences that they have or some configuration of their distinctive beliefs come together to persuade them that something had happened that wasn't what was expected in Judaism that time. Right? Jews who believed in the resurrection expected there to be a general resurrection of all people at the end of time. They didn't expect one person to be brought back from the dead on his own, sort of out of sequence. Right? And it's for this reason that I actually wanted to have the availability of this screen with the possibility of writing in or drawing in fairly straight lines. So let's see how this works. Okay, that's let me go with the one that'll make a nice straight line. Right? Great. So if we ask, what did Jewish belief in this time period look like? You'll sometimes find texts that talk about two ages. And so there's the present age, right, which is dominated by sin, death, evil, unjust rule, organic chemistry exams, and everything that you can think of that causes pain and suffering. And then they expected that there would be an age to come when God would essentially restore paradise, or maybe make things even better than they had been before. And the key moment is the resurrection of the dead, right? That's what that vertical line separating the two ages represents. The resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the wicked are punished or eliminated or whatever, and the righteous live on in the age to come, the Messianic age, the age of resurrection, eternal life. Lots of words and phrases are used to refer to it. That's the expectation. Just to indicate that this is a linear sort of viewpoint. Right? You can do that. So what happens in the case of early Christian belief? We actually see a reconfiguration of earlier Jewish thought. And we'll see examples of this in the New Testament. So if we draw a line again, representing history. Because the early Christians believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. As a result, they believed that the age to come had arrived. You can't have somebody being raised from the dead, not in the sense of restored to life. Right? There are lots of accounts of those kinds of things happening in the Gospels and other literature. Right? People dying and then being restored to life to die again. What the early Christians believed had happened to Jesus was something else, right? That he had been raised into that life of the age to come. And so what early Christians came to believe was that the age to come had begun. In fact, we could just do a little bit of scribbling here, right? Just to indicate this interesting period. So on the one hand, the age to come, they believed, had dawned. The resurrection of the dead had begun. The Messianic age has arrived. The fulfillment of the expectations and the promises has begun to come about. But has evil been eliminated at this point? Yeah. And they didn't need modern organic chemistry exams in order to figure that out, right? The Romans are still ruling. Not everybody's happy. Not everybody's got enough to eat. Not all instances of unjust suffering have been eliminated. And so what the early Christians came to believe was that the period they were living in was a period of overlap between these two ages. So the present age continues, but the age to come has dawned. And they believed that they were, in fact, living in a situation of tension, right, between the two ages. And one of the things we see time and time again in Paul's letters, and we encountered it earlier this semester looking at some of the problems he was dealing with in the church in Corinth, for instance, was the issue of how the relationship is to be balanced between those sets of beliefs, between those two ages that are part of Christian belief. Okay? So if the age to come has dawned, some Corinthians ask, does that mean since in the future age there'll be no marriage and no sex and no other thing, that we stop doing those things now? Right? Paul's answer was no, not necessarily. Right? So we see how a lot of early Christian beliefs and some of the differences between different Christian texts we get in the New Testament relate to the tension that they believe exists between these two ages. So just for the sake of clarity, let me add in a couple of labels. And so if the moment here, right, that marks the start of the age to come is the resurrection of Jesus, the start of the resurrection age, what do you think this moment was for the early Christians in their worldview, when the age to come would be, or the age to come would continue to exist and would arrive in all its fullness, and the present age, dominated by evil and sin and so on, would be brought to an end?
When Jesus comes back.
Yeah, so the second coming. Right? And so what we get in early Christianity is a separation of the things that were expected at the end of time, or the end of human history, the things that were expected with the coming of the Messiah, the things that were expected as part of the age to come, or Messianic age, or resurrection age, or kingdom of God, being split into two. Right? So that some things are said to have occurred already, and some things are pushed off and said to happen still in the future. And so here we have, and I think it's easier to grasp the concept if it's depicted visually. Whether you like this digital whiteboard or not, I hope you'll let me know. But I think it's easier to grasp the concept in a sort of pictorial way, that the early Christians really sort of reconfigured beliefs that they had previously held in light of what they believed had transpired involving Jesus. And so this is all sort of by way of background to us talking about the key texts in the New Testament where we find reference to either the experiences that gave rise to Christian belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead and that the age to come had dawned, and key moments in the development of Christian thought about this topic. Any questions so far? So if we want to look at the earliest text that gives some indication of how Christians came to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, where should we look? What's our earliest source in the New Testament?
The first written.
Yeah, earliest written sources.
Mark was the first of the Gospels, but I don't know if any of the letters were before Mark.
Right, and that's as I think we covered previously. Right? Paul's letters are usually dated before any of the written Gospels, although there's some debate and disagreement. So there's some overlap between the time period when Paul's letters were written and the earliest dates that anyone's argued for the earliest of the Gospels. But most view the letters as earlier. Right? And so what we'll do is we'll start with Paul's letter, and then we'll move on to the Gospel of Mark, because it allows us to look at Christian thought as it's developing, as it's unfolding in chronological order, as it were. And so the first of the texts that we want to look at in order to look at the chronology of early Christian belief is 1 Corinthians 15. In the Gospels, we're going to encounter stories about Easter. We're going to encounter stories about the Sunday after the crucifixion and things that transpire then. And we're going to find that there are some significant puzzles in relating the different accounts to one another. It may actually be helpful in solving some of the puzzles that arise in relation to those texts to go back and look at what Paul says. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he's reminding the Corinthians of the good news that he proclaimed to them. And he says in verse 3, I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn have received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And so here we have the earliest tradition we have of the kinds of experiences that the Gospels also seek to depict in narrative. Okay? People believed that they had seen Jesus after the crucifixion. If we look at just this text, our early source, what could we deduce? And it's very hard, if you're familiar with the Gospel, to put them out of your mind, right? And not read things from there into here. And we shouldn't try to force a wedge between what Paul wrote and what the later Gospels say, as though they're not part of the same tradition and likely to agree on certain key points. Right? But we do want to notice what's different, right? So that we at least reflect on what the significance of those differences are. So what is and is not said here that you might have expected if you were familiar with the Gospel? You don't put it that way. And if you're not familiar with the Gospels, there's obviously no penalty for that. It's not expected, although there was some reading for this time. So, but some of you may already be familiar with them more than others are, and be expecting certain things. What do you find that you expect from an account of the resurrection of Jesus or the Easter story here? What's different than other versions that you know? What's not here that you might have expected? Yeah, Rebecca.
Does it mention, like, the women that found him to begin with? Because you always remember, like, the women found the cave first. And then I don't remember who this Cephas person is.
Yeah, does anybody know that name?
I don't recall him in the others.
It's basically Kepha, which is an Aramaic word which means the same thing as Peter.
Oh, okay.
And so they're both nicknames, which basically meant rock.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so we have some differences already, right? So there's no mention of women finding the tomb. Is there any mention of anyone finding the tomb empty?
No.
Here. No. Whether or not that's significant is important to ask. On the one hand, Paul does mention Jesus having been buried. And so the possibility that he's thinking in terms of Jesus being physically placed in a tomb and then in some sort of physical way brought forth from the tomb, alive again, is certainly a possibility, given that he mentions the burial. On the other hand, if we were to read on in this chapter, we find that Paul says emphatically that the resurrection body is different in kind and of a different nature from the physical bodies that people currently have. And so his belief is that there's some kind of transformation. And he makes a comparison to a seed that's planted in the ground and then what sprouts forth from it. Right? And so if all we had was this text, we might wonder, is this a bodily resurrection? Bodily in what sense? Does it involve the body that Jesus previously had? Is that necessarily part of it? Right? And that's relevant for people who are thinking about this, because one of the things that you will not find at all surprising if you've given thought to what historians can and cannot talk about. While the crucifixion of Jesus, for reasons that we talked about last time, is a fairly secure piece of historical data, possibly the most secure piece of historical data we have about Jesus, when it comes to claims that Jesus was raised from the dead, not just that he was seen after having been crucified, but that he'd entered the life of the age to come, right, which is what the Christians believe. What do you think a historian's going to be able to say about that? They're basically going to set it aside. They might, as we're doing today, look at the question of how did early Christian belief about this develop, right? That can be a historical question. But if the aim is to prove the resurrection using historical tools, then not surprisingly, history is going to face problems. We'll talk more about that next time as part of our sort of open conversation. Does the resurrection involve a tangible experience on the part of those who have these experiences of seeing Jesus? Later Gospels, the latest of our Gospels in the New Testament, will include a tangible element. We'll have Jesus eating or offering to be touched by doubting disciples and stories that you're probably familiar with. Here, though, all we have is that he was seen by these various people. And Paul includes himself on the list, doesn't give any indication that the kind of seeing that he experienced is different from that of other Christians, right? And so, from this source alone, we can't say that we know the answer to those questions. Could it be visions? Could it be spotting someone in a crowd? Could it be having someone walk up to them and say, "Hi, it's me, I'm Jesus"? Could it be any or all of the above? Possibly. From this, our earliest source, we don't know. What else is different from later Gospels? Anything?
500 brothers and sisters at one time.
Yeah,
Do you think they document something of that magnitude?
Yeah, it sounds pretty impressive. And of course, this is something that those not interested in historical study per se, but interested in apologetics, trying to argue the case for the resurrection, will say, "See, there were 500 witnesses."
Yeah, I was going to say, he even says that he saw the apostles last, and earlier Gospels will make it sound that Jesus saw them first, but he said he talked to these 500 people first, and then he talked to the apostles.
Yeah, well, we've got, he appeared to Kepha, or Peter, then to the 12, and then to 500, and then to James, and that, of course, is not mentioned in the canonical Gospels. Right? It is mentioned in extra-canonical Gospels, so there's some interesting intersection or overlap between our earliest source and some later sources. Whether those later sources have independent tradition or are inspired by Paul's letter, it's hard to say. and not something that we need to get distracted with. And then we have an account which, of course, doesn't happen in the Gospels, but in Acts, right? Luke's second volume talks about Paul seeing Jesus, the famous story of the Damascus Road, like the light and everything that's involved there. So the order of the appearances doesn't match up with the other Gospels. That reference to 500 seeing Jesus at one time, on the one hand, it might sound like, well, there we go, it's pretty good proof, right, 500. On the other hand, we don't know, did Paul know somebody who claimed to be one of those 500? Had he heard from somebody who heard from somebody who heard from somebody that there had been 500? We don't know. And so, in a court of law, that's the sort of thing that would be dismissed as hearsay. And so it doesn't help as much. But certainly one can look at the evidence that we have for the early Christians, their behavior. Somebody like Paul, who describes himself as a persecutor of the church, right, in one of his letters, and yet comes to be a proclaimer of the Christian message. Right? You'll sometimes hear people claiming that the change of life in these individuals proves that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. But of course, people have life-changing experiences today and come to believe this. And it doesn't necessarily prove anything about a body 2,000 years ago. What it probably should be taken as indicating, though, and indicating strongly, is that there are people involved in this movement who aren't simply just making these things up. They seem to be genuinely persuaded that something remarkable had happened to Jesus. On what basis? Was it dreams and visions? Was it something that was tangible? From 1 Corinthians 15 alone, we wouldn't be able to say. There are a couple of reasons for starting with 1 Corinthians 15. The very fact that it's earliest, it's the earliest account that we have of what come to be known as the Easter events, the experience of seeing Jesus. That alone is a good enough reason to start here. But in addition to the chronology, right, one other thing that's interesting to think about is that what Paul's giving here, he says this is the tradition he passed on to the Christians in Corinth. And it doesn't take the form, at least as he gives it here, he might be summarizing, but it doesn't take the form of a fully spelled out story. And if we think about traditions and how they circulated, how they would have been passed on by early Christians, it may well be that very often those traditions were passed on in the form of something that was more like a list than a story. Right? These are the key details. It may be that those lists or those traditions in their core essence were then told in the form of stories. One thing that's not mentioned here but is mentioned in all the Gospels, because it has to be mentioned in order for this to become a story, are things like the geographical setting. If we ask, okay, Jesus is said to have been seen by Cephas and then the 12. Where? It doesn't say. Right? Could be in Jerusalem, could be in Galilee, could be somewhere else. When we get to later Gospels, we're going to find Matthew's Gospel including a command that the disciples should go to Galilee and they'll see Jesus there. And we're going to see Luke's Gospel having the disciples commanded to remain in Jerusalem and appearances of Jesus there. It may be that while those kinds of discrepancies trouble historians and trouble careful readers of the Gospels for a number of reasons, it may be that they're not as troubling from a historical perspective as they might be for those who are trying to argue something like, let's say, biblical inerrancy. While it's hard to, if not impossible to, try and get those things to match up, right? You have to have people rushing to Galilee, back to Jerusalem, and it seems to end up that you're telling a story that's not what any of these Gospels gives you the impression happened. But if we think about what these Gospel authors were building on, what they were drawing on, it may well be that they were drawing on a core tradition like what we find embedded in Paul's letter here. And in turning it into a story, they made assumptions about where certain events should be set, and we end up with contradiction. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a core tradition that lay behind this. Any thoughts, comments, or questions at this stage? Well, let's move on to Mark and the end of Mark, Mark 16. And we'll make up for all the discussion that we could be having but are not having today next time, right? So I'm going to come in and basically say, let's talk. What do you want to talk about from last time, and what do you want to talk about now in relation to Easter and Christian belief in the resurrection and things like that? Our earliest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel end in the following way, and I'll just read it so that you get the effect of it. Right? But feel free to read along with me if you're inclined. Mark 16, starting with the first verse. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, that's Sunday, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. Is this a satisfying ending to this gospel? What kinds of things are you hoping for as a reader of this gospel, but not getting if we end there?
Do they really see Jesus?
Okay, do they really see Jesus? Yeah?
A heartwarming reunion scene or something?
Pardon?
Well,
Say that louder.
I said a heartwarming reunion scene or something.
A heartwarming reunion scene or something, yeah, sure. Right. Actual stories about people seeing Jesus. In fact, if you knew the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, you'd be expecting that. And if you've been reading the Gospel of Mark, you're expecting that. Right? Because here it says they're to go to Galilee and they'll see Jesus there. And while there's some disagreement in manuscripts, we have an indication that there is an earlier prediction, right, as Mark 16 refers to it, where Jesus tells Peter that after he's died, he'll be seen by them again. But even if we didn't have that earlier reference, in Mark 16 it says, "Go tell the disciples they'll see." What do the women do according to this account?
They didn't say it.
They didn't say anything. So what question might you have as a reader? If they didn't, did they say anything? If they didn't say anything to anyone, how can I be reading this? It's a good question to ask. If they didn't say anything to anyone, did the disciples actually end up seeing Jesus?
It's a cliffhanger.
It's a cliffhanger. And there are several ways that people have tried to make sense of what we find in the Gospel of Mark and its ending. On the one hand, there are those who say that it's a cliffhanger, right? It's open-ended, and you're supposed to fill in your own ending or something like that. Right? And that's possible, right? That certainly is possible. But we have a fairly clear indication, in fact, we could say it's multiply attested. We have a fairly clear indication that early Christian readers were similarly unsatisfied with the ending there. In most academic study Bibles, you'll actually have what you don't always get included in translations, but you'll see that there's something called a shorter ending of Mark and a longer ending of Mark. So we've got our earliest manuscripts end with verse 8. After that, in some manuscripts, there's a shorter ending which is added, and in other manuscripts, there's a longer ending which is added. And then if we add to this that Matthew and Luke are also both thought to have used Mark as a source, then we have 4, at least, different individuals in the early church indicating that they're not satisfied with this ending, right? You have at least 2 different scribes copying Mark's gospel adding endings because they feel like something's missing. And we have 2, maybe 3 if you think John used Mark's gospel. There's debate about that. But we have some other gospel writers very early on using Mark's gospel and feeling it necessary to tell a further story. One possibility is that Mark left it as a cliffhanger. And of course, if you're part of the early Christian movement reading this, you know additional stories beyond that, right? And so it might not have seemed as abrupt to early Christian readers. It's possible, though, that there's a fairly simple explanation. And it may be that the original ending to Mark's gospel became lost. And it's a great point at which to posit a conspiracy theory, right? There was something in that ending that somebody didn't want people to know. If you like conspiracy theories, there's a great opportunity to, you could write the next Da Vinci Code bestseller or something like that. We have no reason to think there was a conspiracy. And in fact, simple damage to the original manuscript probably makes just as much sense, if not better. If you've ever read magazines or comic books and kept them for a long time, you'll have experienced something that's probably as close as anybody today has experienced in everyday life to what ancient books were like. Right? They were made by folding over sheets of papyrus. Right? Sometimes they were stitched, but not always. What's the first thing to go? Pardon?
The ending or the introduction?
Yeah, the ending or the introduction, the beginning and ending, those sheets that make the beginning and ending. And in fact, Clayton Croy, a New Testament scholar, has written a book suggesting that maybe the beginning of the Gospel of Mark got lost as well. Because the start of it is the beginning of the good news or gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Is that in fact somebody copying this text and saying, here's the beginning as I have it? It's an interesting suggestion. But we have a lot of texts from the ancient world where the beginning or the ending or both have been damaged or gone missing. And so it's not impossible, and it doesn't require a conspiracy, although if you want a best-selling novel, you might need to explore that further. If the women don't say anything to anyone because they're afraid, what happens next? What can you imagine happening next?
Either someone else visits the cave, or they get confronted with the same issue again, that they have to say something, and they keep getting appearances by angels or Jesus until they actually do say something.
And we actually have Matthew using an idea not unlike yours, right? And we'll take a quick look. I know we're running out of time, but we'll take a quick look at what Matthew and Luke do. If you're the disciples and you don't get this reminder, where are the disciples from? At least most of them. Anybody know? From Galilee. And the person you've been following has been arrested and executed. Whether you've hung around this long or not, what do? Run. Go back home. And so one possible continuation of the story is that the disciples go to Galilee because they're going to go there anyway. And so whether or not they get the reminder, they have these experiences. And what's interesting is that we have an account which is found in the New Testament, but it's often struck readers as more like a first encounter, or an account of a first encounter with Jesus, than one that has happened after a previous one. And we find this in what seems like an appendix to the Gospel of John. John chapter 20 has at the end of an account of Jesus appearing to the disciples, and this is the version that has, appears to all of them but Thomas, and then appears to Thomas, who had previously been doubting. And it ends with, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." And it seems like a perfectly good ending, but then we have more. Right? And so it's been suggested that John 21 might have been part of a second edition, or may have been a later edition. And the story that's told here has the disciples, or a subset of the disciples, going fishing, which doesn't make as much sense after they've been commissioned and sent out, right? So it may be that this story is not in logical, chronological order here. And somebody appears on the shore, right? It says, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And even when they see him up close, apparently it seems like they're still not identifying him through sight, but they become persuaded that it's him. There's an account of an encounter along the Sea of Galilee when they're fishing. And we can imagine that that would have made sense, as an ending to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark starts with, the first encounter of the disciples with Jesus as they're fishing along the Sea of Galilee. And so it would be a nice bookend if that were the story that concluded there. We also have an extra canonical account known as the Gospel of Peter. Not actually written by Peter, in case there were any doubts, but that's the title that's been given to that work. Has Peter talking in the first person, but it tells the story of, much as it's found in Mark's Gospel, of the disciples fleeing. Women go to the tomb. They flee out of fear. And then it begins to tell a story about the disciples going fishing. And so it seems as though that text might have had, did it have access to the original version of Mark's Gospel with its ending? Who knows? It's hard to know. But there are a lot of clues that suggest how Mark's Gospel might have continued, if you think that there's an original ending which had been lost. We don't know. But speculation can be fun sometimes. As somebody who's interested in the historical figure of Jesus, and has actually written some things on the burial of Jesus, because it's one of those moments that gets neglected in accounts of the crucifixion and Easter. I've had some interest in this, and so I've done some writing on this topic. And we'll gladly tell you more about it on some other occasion if you're interested. Let's take a quick look at what Matthew and Luke do. At the end of Matthew's Gospel, we have more or less the same thing where the women go to the tomb. An angel says, go tell the disciples. He's going ahead of them to Galilee. They'll see him there. In verse 8 it says, so they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came to him, took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see him. And so we then, at the very end, have the account of the 11 disciples, lacking Judas, going to Galilee. And one really interesting verse, it says, when they saw him, they worshipped him, verse 17, but some doubted. And I just find that verse so intriguing, because there are so many authors in recent times who've tried to write books that say things like, the resurrection proven beyond doubt. And yet this ancient author talking about the experiences of those who had whatever these Easter experiences were like, having doubts. And so it seems as though it may be that modern people are longing for something that the text suggests might escape them. But that's a discussion for another time and another occasion. But it depicts them being commissioned and sent out, right? And you have this famous passage, often referred to as the Great Commission. In the Gospel of Luke, we have an account which mirrors something that we also get in the Gospel of John. The women go and tell the apostles, who are still in Jerusalem at this stage. Verse 11, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home amazed at what happened. And then there's the account of two disciples on their way to Emmaus, who experienced Jesus in the breaking of the bread, which is interesting, which is Eucharistic or Last Supper kind of overtone. And then the disciples are told at the end of it to wait in Jerusalem. They'll be clothed with power from on high. And that's a story that Luke then continues in the second volume. And Luke ends with an account of Jesus ascending to heaven, so literally going up into the air. the Gospel of John seems to combine those two traditions of Jerusalem and Galilee appearances, and perhaps is intentionally trying to reconcile the two. There's an account of Jesus appearing and of Thomas doubting because he hadn't seen. And there's an account by the Sea of Galilee as well. And so we have some quite diverse accounts. And some of the geographical movements seem to be difficult and not impossible to get to line up with one another. But we also seem to have very strong evidence for a core tradition that was central to early Christian proclamation and the development of early Christianity, which is the belief that some people, after the crucifixion, had seen Jesus not simply alive, but in some way had seen him in a manner that persuaded them that he had been raised from the dead, not in the sense of resuscitated, but in the sense of entering the life of the age to come. What those experiences were like, what the details of these stories might imply, what questions you might have, and what the answers to those questions might be are things that we'll have to leave until next time because we're out of time. Thank you.